Hello? Hi. Everybody. Welcome back to Track 2, Building and Activating Your Community. We hope you enjoyed the networking lunch break sponsored by Pfizer. My name is Miguel. I'm with Fulgent Genetics, and I'll be your host for this afternoon session. As a reminder, this track is being live streamed, and I'd like to welcome our remote attendees and remind everybody to download our mobile app and use our live Q&A. So coming up to the stage is Terry Jo Bichell, founder and director of Combined Brain, and Leo Sahelijo, vice president of translational medicine at Ionis, who will be discussing the importance of ICD codes rather than symptoms. These experts will share how an ICD code can provide advantages to a rare disease this session. Your diagnosis matters, what are ICD and Orpha codes, and why are they important? Please join me in welcoming them.
Okay, am I on? Yes, oh good, you can hear me. Okay, hello everybody. Nice to have you here for this thrilling talk on numbers, ICD-10 and Orpha codes, but we're gonna make it very exciting, you'll see. So what I want to talk to you about is what happened to me when my son was diagnosed. I have a 20-year-old son with Angelman syndrome. At that time, I was a nurse midwife. My husband was a congenital heart surgeon, still is a congenital heart surgeon. I had a degree in public health, and when we were told that our son had Angelman syndrome, we went into professional mode. The very first thing we did was say, okay, we have a child with a rare disorder, we need to know what is gonna make him sick, what is gonna send him to the hospital, and what might kill him. That was the first, I know that might not seem like a normal thing to face right when you get a diagnosis, but we were medical professionals and that's what we wanted to know. And so we immediately started digging into the data to see if we could find out. And I don't know if you all know this, but on the death certificates of anyone's death certificate, there is a diagnosis code for the cause of death. There are also other diagnosis codes on there for other things and symptoms that the person might have had when they died. Every time they go to the hospital, there's a code, and I'm going to talk about this some more. So right away, we tried to find that out, and what we found out was that there was no code for Angelman syndrome. So there was no way for us to find out easily. I mean, we, of course, went into PubMed. We looked up every publication we could find, but those are case reports. Those don't really tell you sort of over a long period of time all the people who exist with Angelman syndrome. There was no way to know how many people in the United States had Angelman syndrome. There was no way to know how many people with Angelman syndrome got sick every year. Or how many people, there was no way to know if people with Angelman syndrome lived in the East Coast more, or the West Coast, the ethnicity, anything. We couldn't get any of those questions answered. I mean, there were little studies. So, for example, there was a study in England where they had done a test of a whole county and tested pretty much everyone there for Angelman syndrome to see who had Angelman syndrome, and they had found sort of a prevalence rate. There were other tests like that found prevalence rates. There were other studies that looked at what it seemed like over the lifespan people with Angelman syndrome might get sick from or might die from, but there was really no way to know for sure if that was accurate. And so right at the beginning, we found ourselves sort of stuck because we didn't have an ICD-10 code for Angelman syndrome. So what is an ICD-10 code? So actually, it's really a social security number of a disorder. That's basically what it is. I mean, your child is not a number. You are not a number, but you know you need your social security number to do a lot of things. You need your date of birth. You need numbers to get a lot of things done. You need your passwords. You need your phone number. The ICD-10 code is the social security number for a disorder. So what does it stand for? It stands for the International Classification of Diseases, 10th Revision, Clinical Modification. And this is run by the World Health Organization. This is an international classification. However, a lot of different countries have their own little modifications, so not everything that you're going to have here in the States is going to be the same as everywhere else. It's a system set to classify and code every diagnosis, every symptom, and every procedure. And the World Health Organization monitors it and sort of takes care of it in the whole world. But here in the United States, it's actually the CDC in Atlanta and the National Center for Health Statistics. And so when you want to get a code here in the United States, and I'm going to tell you how to do that, you go through that agency. So ORPHA numbers are another kind of number, also very interesting, not exactly the same kind of thing. ORPHA numbers come from the ORPHANET. First of all, in this room, how many people know if the disorder you care about has an ICD-10 code? Does your disorder have an ICD-10 code? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. How many people in this room know for sure your disorder does not have an ICD-10 code? About a little bit less, or about the same. Okay. How many of you all already know about the ORPHANET? Okay, cool. The ORPHANET was started in France, and it's basically a data clearinghouse, so you can find out a lot of things about rare diseases there. They have all these portals. And in a way, it's a little bit like Wikipedia, where people who use it and who are expert users can actually contribute to it and update it. So it's important for you to dig into ORPHANET and look and see if they have things about your disorder and if they're right or not. And that's really kind of important. Just to prepare for this talk, I went in and looked up Angelman syndrome, and guess what? They had the code wrong in the ORPHANET. So you have to, be vigilant on these things. But it's important because what the ORPHANET does, so here's the Angelman syndrome page, and I'm going to give all my examples from Angelman syndrome because that's what I know. But hopefully it'll extrapolate to everything that you all care about too. And we're going to ask, can we have questions all through it? Or we have to wait till the end? We'll wait till the end. We don't want to mess up the system. Okay, but please feel free to ask a bazillion questions at the end. So the thing about Angelman syndrome, if you look on the ORPHANET page for Angelman syndrome, what you see on there is you've got the ICD-10 code, the prevalence, the OMIM number. It's basically all the numbers that would link you to more information on Angelman syndrome. But if you look at this ICD-10 code there, can you see it in the middle right here? This ICD-10 code, Q93.5, it's not Angelman syndrome. That code is a number for other deletions of a chromosome. There are, if you click it, which I did, what you'll see is there are 174 disorders under that code. Every single one of those disorders has a different deletion. Some of you all who are sitting in this room might have that code, and your child might not get sick, or your loved one or your patient might not get sick, might not die, might not need the same procedure that mine would need. But they're lumped under that same number. So if you try to do research on that, if you try to prove the disease burden, if you try to prove how much money it costs to treat your patient, if you try to prove why they went to the hospital, if you use that code, you're going to be proving something for 174 disorders. It's not going to be just for your disorder. So, what does an ICD-10 code mean to patients? So let me go back one more. All right, so this is the number that we had before, Q93.5. Sounds like a radio station to me. I know, right. I always thought, one of these days I'll just have to call that radio station, get them to advertise for Angelman stuff or something. But just remember that number, Q93.5. So what does an ICD-10 code mean for patients? So every diagnosis has a number. So here's an example. K21.9 is the code for reflux. And so if I go to the doctor here because I have reflux because I've been drinking too much coffee because I'm worried about my presentation and I got to stay up really late doing my slides and now I have reflux and I go to the doctor, they're going to write K21.9 on my medical record. Okay? And the more we have electronic medical records, the more these numbers are even more important because it's much more easier to search, research, track, everything. So now if I go back home again and I go to my doctor and I say, oh, I had reflux in San Diego, they're going to write down K21.9 on my record for gastroesophageal reflux. So that symptom is actually also a symptom of Angelman syndrome. Okay, I do not have Angelman syndrome. My son has Angelman syndrome. He might have that symptom, K21.9. I might have that symptom, K21.9. But that doesn't mean that I have Angelman syndrome. If I'm trying to do research on reflux, it's very hard to link it to Angelman syndrome without the Angelman syndrome diagnosis. It's also different when you have a permanent diagnosis compared to an acute diagnosis. So reflux, maybe I only have it today. I'm not going to have it next week or the week after that. But Angelman syndrome, if I'm born with it, I'm going to have it the rest of my life. It's a genetic mutation. So if that diagnosis code travels with me for the rest of my life, that's going to actually suggest treatments to doctors. That's going to actually suggest what insurance companies can bill for. That's actually going to be a way for us as patients to prove how much it costs to have a disorder. So, and it can last for a lifetime of care. So, I put on there for an example, and I hope Leo has time to talk a little bit about SMA. We're going to have me talk a bit, and then Leo talk a bit, and then me talk a bit. So, and hopefully he'll talk to you about it from the perspective of the drug development process. So SMA is one of the conditions that Ionis is working on, and SMA recently got its code, thank goodness, because it can be tracked and studied. So how are these codes used? So there's used for diagnosis, and you know how now electronic medical records, I don't know how many of you know how it works, but you're sitting there in the doctor, and they write down, okay, Angelman syndrome and reflux, right? And then their next field might come up a whole bunch of things. Like it automatically asks them, did you already get genetic testing? Or did you already offer reflux medicines? So whatever diagnosis code they put in is actually going to pull up particular treatments. So it's used by hospitals to describe the patient's health and also to even pull up possible treatments and then outcomes. So the hospital might say, how many people with Angelman syndrome who had anesthesia this year actually had complications from anesthesia? That's a study that I actually worked on, only we didn't have an ICD-10 code. So we actually had to go through every single chart and look for the word Angelman. It was hellish. Okay, so now that we have the ICD-10 code and people can put that in the record, we could actually click Angelman and pull up all the patients with Angelman. Then we could click anesthesia and pull up all those patients with anesthesia. And then we could click length of stay in the hospital to find out, do they stay longer than people without Angelman or not? You see, you're starting to get the feel for the power of a number. So they also are used, ICD-10 codes are used by governments to track diseases. So for example, if you get the flu or if you get tuberculosis or if you get anything, Ebola, and they want to track it and see, are those diagnoses popping up all over the country? Do you have a cluster in Tennessee and a cluster in New York? It's a way to find out whether you have a spread of a disorder or you have something caused by an environmental cause, something like that. They're also used to describe a cause of death. So if you look at a death certificate, you should see right on there an ICD-10 code. And that will right away help you do research on mortality in the disorder that you're working with, which I think is really important. And then, like I said, it's also used internationally, although it's a little different country to country, so sometimes you still have to double check what their numbers are in each other country. So how is it added to the record? Well, it sort of depends. Some places it's almost automatic. Some places you pay for a coder. So the doctor sees a patient, writes the note, and then the coder looks at the note and writes down all the different diagnoses and puts all the codes on. And that's how they bill you. And that's how they send the claims to the insurance agency, and that's what gets put in the electronic medical record. That's where it leads to big data. And this is where we really get the power of the number. Because we can, once you have the ICD-10 number, you can go through vital records for the whole country. That means, vital records means birth certificates, death certificates, hospital admission rates, hospital length of stay, things like that. You can go through the PCORnet database. That was so frustrating for me. I had a job right after I finished my PhD, and I wanted to search the entire PCORI database, which is this merged database from lots of hospitals, and I wanted to go through that and compare Prader-Willi admission rates to Angelman admission rates, and I wanted to look at those things, and there was no way for me to pull up any of those records because we didn't have a number. You can also do research on the electronic health records I've been talking about. You can find out prevalence, risk factors, comorbidities. You know, like how many people with Angelman, I keep saying reflux, but that's a good example, but how many of them also have seizures? How many of them also have scoliosis? How many of them also have ataxia? You can look up all those things. And you can look up how much it costs, which in the end is also going to be a way for you to argue for getting a treatment, even if a treatment costs a lot of money. Because if you know how much it costs to take care of a child who's untreated and how many rates of hospitalizations they have and how many treatments they need, it helps you argue for why you should be able to pay, the insurance company should be able to pay for a treatment even if it's expensive. And maybe the most important, it also helps do research on treatment outcomes. So let's say for seizures in Angelman syndrome, some doctors make you do a 3-day inpatient EEG. Other doctors make you do a 2-hour EEG. You could actually track which of those EEGs then leads to reduction in doctor visits after that. And I don't know about you all, but I hate 3-day inpatient EEGs. I will do whatever I can to avoid them. So that's just an example about even a testing outcome. Okay, so I already told you that having a unique number is really important. And I already told you that under Q93.5, there are lots of other microdeletions. You can see a partial list here that has absolutely nothing to do with Angelman syndrome, but it's all lumped in together. So I felt bad a little bit when I tried fighting for an ICD-10 code. I heard people say like, well, if we give one to you, we'll have to give one to every rare disease. And so at first I started thinking, oh, you know, I don't want to be greedy and have a number if not everybody can. Let me tell you something. They have ICD-10 numbers for bitten by an orca, sequelae. They have ICD-10 numbers for bitten by a poisonous snake on left wrist, bitten by poisonous snake on right wrist, bitten by non-poisonous snake on left ankle, bitten by, there are so many very, very detailed ICD-10 codes, and still, for rare disorders, there are very few. So there's even this illustrated playing card set that you can get to learn how ICD-10 cards work, and they use the weird ones for that. So it can really show you how ICD-10 codes can be very, very specific. So without a unique code, what that meant was Angelman syndrome was just a pile of symptoms. Just reflux, seizures, sleep disorder, nonverbal developmental delay, anxiety, pneumonia, but without the cause, no link to the gene. And we're looking for genetic treatments here. So that's where I go over to Leo, so he can talk to you about how this helps get to a genetic treatment. Let me see does it come right up? No, uh-oh. So we have to put Leo's slides on now. They were supposed to be mixed in, but somehow didn't get mixed in. So while they're putting Leo's slides, any questions? Yes.
Where there is an ICD-10 code, but there is a secondary condition. So say your son got pneumonia and was hospitalized. Should they be putting in, and he's hospitalized for pneumonia, are they putting in the ICD-10 code for pneumonia, or are they putting in the ICD-10 code for Angelman, or are they putting in both?
Both. That's the whole point. So you have to be able to search on both. So you would want to be able to search on Angelman. Yay, you exist. You would want to be able to search on both Angelman and pneumonia.
So should we be teaching patients and caregivers to double check that record? And double check that coding?
We should.
Okay.
But truthfully, right now, it's such a revolution in the electronic medical record, it's hard enough to even get the doctors to do it right. I mean, we really do have to be super vigilant, though, especially with rare disorders, or we're going to miss a lot of stuff. So, okay.
Thank you.
You would need that. Yep.
Okay, thanks for having me. I was asked to give a talk on how ICD codes are used in clinical drug development. And so I'm trying to describe the clinical drug development process because I actually didn't know, what the knowledge would be in the room about how drug development works in general. So if I'm repeating stuff that you already know, I apologize, but I just will summarize briefly how the process works from target identification to ultimately, hopefully, an approval of a drug. And by the way, I did not know that there's an ICD code for an orca bite. That is something that is... Did you know that there's no factor 12 in dolphins?
Really? No.
Okay, so... Oh.
Okay, it's good now.
Can you hear me now? Hello? I can do it this way. Okay, so actually the drug development process in humans really starts with having an IND, which is an investigational new drug. And you have to apply to this. This is a process that is specific for the US. There are other processes around the world that have a different name, but essentially the same thing applies. You have to go to a regulatory authority and get an approval for starting a clinical trial in humans. And in order to do so, you have to submit a data set that is sort of documenting the safety of the compound, which is associated with many of these animal studies that are being done, toxicology studies. You have to submit manufacturing information. Is this now?
No.
Hello? Okay, yeah. Manufacturing information about the compound itself, which has to fulfill certain requirements, impurity, and so forth. And you have to submit clinical protocols. What you're trying to test, what the endpoints are, the outcomes that Terry Jo was talking about, and information about the investigators who are going to perform the clinical studies. Technically speaking, an IND in the US is something that was created by the FDA to allow for interstate commerce, to be able to transport a drug across state lines. But that is obviously a requirement to be able to run a clinical study, because oftentimes the clinical studies are not necessarily run in the state where the drug was created or are run in multiple sites across the US. The next important step is the NDA, the new drug application, which is actually the moment that manufacturer, the producer of the drug has pulled together sufficient data to show that the benefit outweighs the risks, if you will. As you know, any drug can be a toxin. It depends on the dose, right? And so what the FDA obviously uses to assess whether it's worthwhile letting a drug on the market is the balance between the benefit that someone derives from being exposed to the drug as relative to the risk. You have to document this by collecting all the data that you have from your clinical studies and show that the drug is not only safe, but actually efficacious. And the level of evidence also has to exceed efficaciousness on an absolute level. It has to be more efficacious relative to another drug, to get reimbursement, actually. So that's a good thing. In the old days, you could come with a drug that was a me too, a generic ripoff or something that didn't have really any additional advantages to the original drug, and get approved. Nowadays, you have to have an additional burden of evidence. You have to show that your drug is oftentimes better than the existing drug. Now, the drug development timelines, this is sort of the timeline that is known to be associated with the development of small molecules. And I'm sort of briefly saying that there are, at this point in time, 4 technology platforms that the industry is using. Small molecules, which are small chemical entities that are synthetics. Then you have the so-called biologics, oftentimes antibodies. We have an entity that my company is producing. It is so-called antisense oligonucleotides, which are small pieces of synthetic DNA. And then the last technology platform is gene therapy. Now, I'm talking about timelines associated with small molecules because the vast majority of medications that are out there in the market are actually small molecules, if you think of aspirin and all these kinds of chemical entities. But the principle is the same. So drug discovery essentially starts with a target that you want to follow. Target identification and characterization. You think about the target product profile. What would be the label of the drug when it gets approved? What indication are you going to target? And then you have all this slew of things. One important thing that I wanted to emphasize here is natural history, because that is something that really is important in diseases that are not as well documented because they're rarer. And so the time frame usually associated with this period of drug discovery and preclinical work, animal studies and so forth, is 7 to 8 years. Once you've finished your preclinical package, identified your lead candidate that you want to take into clinic, you submit your IND, your investigational new drug application that I talked about just a few minutes ago. And if the FDA approves your application, then you can start your clinical studies. Usually that entails that you have a certain series of studies or study phases. The phase 1 usually is done in most cases in healthy volunteers and targets safety, not efficacy, but safety of the drug. That's why it's done mostly in healthy volunteers. Sometimes the drugs are too toxic to put into healthy volunteers, or there are other reasons why it is not feasible to do this in healthy volunteers. Most common in oncology drugs, which are by their very nature cytotoxic. And so in that case, you will not be able to do these initial studies in healthy volunteers. These are usually smaller studies because the target is safety, usually around, let's say, 100 or 200 patients. Then you enter phase 2, where in that phase you actually do studies in patients. And you try to get to a proof of concept, a proof of principle, where you can show that the drug has initial signals of efficacy. The studies are relatively small, probably less than 500 patients. And so in order to show an effect on efficacy, you will have to rely on what is called biomarkers. So these are markers that are sort of readouts for the fact that the drug that you've put into a human actually asserts the effect that you are expecting of it. It is actually getting to the target that you identified in your drug discovery. It's doing what it should do with the target and elicits a certain effect in that individual. And so those are elements, pharmacodynamic elements that you can measure with these markers. The most famous marker that is being used is, for example, in hypertension, measuring how the blood pressure decreases if you are exposed to an antihypertensive drug. So that's a marker. It's not really a clinical effect in the sense that it doesn't tell you whether the drug, because it lowers blood pressure, actually leads to less cardiovascular events or a decrease in mortality, but it's a marker that gives you an idea whether the drug is effective. And then in phase 3, those are usually large studies where you go for comparative efficacy, you go for larger patient cohorts where you want to show that effect, that clinical effect of your drug. Again, this probably it takes another 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer. So the entire drug development process can take probably 15 years from target identification to drug that gets on the market. So here you see an example of the drug attrition rate that is usually believed to be the case here. So from the 10,000 compounds that have been synthesized in a compound library at a pharmaceutical company, ultimately only one gets to the market. From the drugs, the 5 drugs that enter stage 3, only one gets approved. So it's a huge attrition rate, as you can see here. Now, the drug development process in rare diseases, I think, is even more challenging, as Cherry Jo also had pointed out. Oftentimes, we are not familiar with the natural history. We don't know what the patient journey is when the patient gets diagnosed with the disease, how long it took, how many misdiagnoses were done before, how many mistreatments were prescribed. So oftentimes, that's not well documented. In terms of the outcomes, the belief that a particular outcome may be clinically relevant may differ between what a physician believes and what is actually relevant for caretakers and families. Even if we think about a genetic disease that is caused by a particular mutation, and Terry Jo was mentioning OMIM on one of his slides, so which actually stands for an organization that collects data on Mendelian diseases, which are putatively the result of a single gene mutation. Even if that's the case, as we all know, there's a large phenotypic variance. So if you, for example, take Angelman syndrome, we have silencing of a paternal allele on chromosome 15 in Angelman's, but the variance in the patient population can be quite large. So the phenotypic variance, meaning the way a patient presents, can be very different. And then, as Terry Jo was saying, we oftentimes don't know how large the population is. The incidence, that is to say, the number of new cases per year, or the prevalence, the number of cases of patients that exist at any given moment in time, that is something that is oftentimes, certainly in rare diseases, not well documented. So this is an example of spinal muscular atrophy, the disease that Ionis has been working on and is still working on. And SMA is a disease of children. Usually there's a distinction between 3 types, and I listed the types here, and as you can see, these types differ in severity of the phenotype. So type 1 is a phenotype where the children die young. The mortality rate is up to 95% before the 2nd birthday. Again, this is a disease that has a mutation in a certain gene, but the phenotypic variance can be large. So here you see, again, the survival probabilities in years on the top, and so for per type. And as you can see, SMA type 3 is mild, usually associated or believed to be associated with a nearly normal lifespan, whereas SMA type 1 is devastating, and 100% of the children are dead before their 10th birthday. So if you think about this, in order to be able to intervene quickly and be able to, in particular, if you think about the type 1 SMA, have a therapy available for the children before they have developed the most severe symptoms, i.e. be able to treat them before they are, let's say, a year old, you have to be able to identify them, right? And so I think, there are ways to accelerate the drug development process to be able to do so. And I think my company has shown that that is the case. There's a drug in the market now by Ionis, which is an antisense oligonucleotide by the name of nusinersen, Spinraza, which has rescued the most severe phenotype. And so I think we can accelerate drug development based on the access to these large databases that Terry Jo just mentioned. And so it always strikes me that this is actually relatively unknown. There are many, many organizations, insurance companies, healthcare organizations, diagnostic companies. If you think about, every time you go to a lab and there's something determined in your urine or your blood, the informed consent that you sign actually gives the company the right to use your data in a de-identified form. So you are not being identified, but the data can be compiled, the database can be sold, which is happening. So all these things, public-private repositories, for example, 23andMe is a public-private repository, where in fact, the data, you submit your sample, your saliva sample or your blood sample to the organization. They do genetic testing. Those genetic tests can be compiled and sold. And so while many people may see that as a threat, and I completely understand that in terms of privacy and confidentiality, it also can be useful in trying to use these data and actually get access to the demographic data that we are missing. ICD codes are part of that. So ICD codes are the way to extract information from these large databases. And actually, there's also ways to use the same code not only to extract, but also to disseminate information, which I find pretty interesting because the patient advocacy group at Ionis pointed out to me that that is something that they've been actively involved in with SMA. And so you get access to all the data that I listed, potentially access to all the data that I just listed are missing or are one of the reasons why it's difficult to develop a drug quickly. So you get the diagnosis, you get the lab results, you get genomic data on the patients. You know when a particular patient got a diagnosis and whether the diagnosis later on was changed and how long it took to correct that mistake, what kind of therapy was initiated and probably changed and when it was done, and what the reasons were for that. So all things that are really relevant in trying to understand the natural history of a disease. More importantly, oftentimes these databases come with an opportunity via the collector of these databases, the administrator, to have a reach-back mechanism to the individuals that submitted samples or, in this case, treating physicians who submitted diagnosis codes, a reach-back mechanism to reach back to them and see whether you can start a so-called prospective study, where you collect additional data, try to to identify biomarkers, for example, that are specific for that disease and give you an opportunity to measure drug effect. So the ICD codes really provide a mechanism to capture the diagnostic path, as I said. And interestingly enough, in the use of these ICD codes, my company has used it also to try and use it as an educational tool. So every time a physician, for example, submits the ICD code for SMA in a database, it shows up. We can see that that diagnosis has been submitted, and we can reach out to that physician and tell him there are studies ongoing, for example, or there are foundations, registries out there, that can help find resources for the patient and the families. So there's also an aspect there that you can actually use this to disseminate information. And this is the letter that has been used by Ionis to do so. So there are many ways to skin a cat. Sorry about that. These are part of the codes that you can use to identify and make more specific your search for diseases or procedures and so forth. And I think that's really at my end. Yeah, so these were the objectives, to have a more effective patient outreach, be able to identify the patient population, have a better way of resource allocation and so forth. And more importantly, potentially accelerate clinical studies.
Okay. So can I have the rest of my slides up? Thank you. So you're starting to get the idea of how important they are. So now I'm going to tell you how to get one. So you remember that we did not have one for Angelman syndrome. ICD-10 means it's the 10th version. So there was ICD-9, 8, 7, 6, 5, all that beforehand. So when my son was diagnosed, it was the ICD-9 version, and there was a Prader-Willi code, but there wasn't an Angelman code. I was so jealous of those Prader-Willi people because they had their own code, and we didn't have our code. So finally, when my son was about 18, we went ahead and applied for an ICD-10 code. When I say we, I mean the Angelman community. How do you apply? I'm going to tell you how. First, you apply in writing, then you wait a long time. Then you apply in person if you get passed through the written phase, and then you wait a long time. And then you send supporting letters of support, and then you wait a long time. And then they decide and let you know if you've got your ICD-10 code. So the request for the March meeting, so if you all want an ICD-10 code and you don't have one and you need to send in an application, the written application has to get there by December 6, 2019. That's to the CDC. And then final decisions after that meeting where you would present in person would then go into effect in another year. So if you're in a hurry, start now because you want to get this done quickly because it takes a while. And the request for next September, because the meeting just happened last week for this fall. So the request for next September should be sent by June. If anyone here is in a big hurry and they want to get their application in, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help you. So the written application is not a huge tome. It's about 3 to 4 pages. You're actually describing what your disorder is, what is the current code used, so for example, with Angelman, we said it's the 93.5, and then we have to explain why that's no good for us. And then we have to explain why having a unique code makes a big difference. And then what's really important here is that this is meant to be for morbidity and mortality. You are not meant to argue for recruitment to clinical trials or billing purposes. However, we all know that in fact these codes do help with those things. And so it's very important that when you send your application in, you describe what you need to know about the epidemiology of your disorder. And there are plenty of examples. I can give you examples if you want to get a hold of me about successful applications, including ours. And then if your written application is considered to be a good one, then they will ask for your disorder to come and make a presentation in person at the meeting. And you can see these presentations, so you can study up and figure out what you're supposed to say and what you're supposed to do, because they're all on YouTube. So you can watch them, you can look at the historical ones, you can look at them from every other meeting in the past, and you can see which ones worked and which ones didn't work. And so basically you have a clinician present, a clinician who's super knowledgeable on your disorder, but you also want to have some people there sitting in the audience, somebody like myself, somebody like yourselves, who also can speak on behalf of the disorder and talk about why it makes a big difference to the people in your community. What you want are patient advocates and clinicians. You do not want academia and industry. And then, after you make your presentation, you want to have letters of support. And those letters of support are going to be from big groups. So for example, the American Academy of Pediatricians, the American College of Medical Genetics, the Epilepsy Society. You want to have these kind of consortia and foundations write letters of support to say why they think it's important that your disorder have a code. And then, so, here's what I got to tell you. We got our code. Our code. Q93.51. Woohoo! The 1 is the key to the difference between Q93.5 and Angelman syndrome. So we got that. So here's the weird part. I then called up my friend who does research on Prader-Willi, and I said, yay, now we have a code too, just like you. It turned out they had a code in ICD-9, but it got dropped in ICD-10. They no longer had a code in ICD-10. So just because you got a code in the ICD-10 doesn't mean you can let your guard down, not even for a minute. So as soon as you get your code, you've got to publicize it, you got to get your patients to use it, you got to get doctors to use it, insurance companies to use it, and then you have to start using it. Start doing research with it, start digging into what you can find out. So, don't worry, I'm almost done. Oh God, there's ICD-11 already coming down the pike. And so there is ICD-11 already accepted in the rest of the world, but not in the United States. And likely it will not be accepted in the United States for at least 10 years. So double check now to see if you have an ICD-11 code already for your disorder. They're totally different. So for example, Angelman in ICD-10 is listed under deletions, microdeletions, but in ICD-11, it's listed under disorders of cognitive disability. So luckily for my friend who does research on Prader-Willi, they went through the whole application process and they got their code for Prader-Willi. Woo! So they got their 1 after that. Yay! So they can also do research. And luckily for us, we don't have to fight for a code in ICD-11 because there already is a code for Angelman syndrome in ICD-11. However, we may want to fight for all the different genetic subtypes to have their own code because the treatments that are coming down the pike are not going to be the same for every single subtype. So for example, the antisense oligo that Ionis is making might help some subtypes more than others. So we'll give them a year or two, we'll do some research with our Q93.51, and then we'll try to hit them for the next level of detail. So I just want to let you know this is these are all of my kids. In my family, he's number 5. He's not number 93.51. He's the 5th kid. And I'm now the head of an organization called Combined Brain that looks for biomarkers and outcome measures for rare neurodevelopmental disorders. So I would love to talk to any of you who are interested in that. And now, can we have questions?
Cool. Wow, give it up for Terry and for Leo. All right. So I do want to be considerate of the people who are submitting questions online as well, so we'll give them some time, but maybe we'll go ahead and open it to the floor.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have just a quick question, and it kind of piggybacks a little bit on what was said before. But when you have the codes that you already have, say you already have a code in place, and how do you get the doctors or whoever to actually use the code for specifically mortality? So for example, in myositis, which is the disease that I represent, oftentimes people die from falls or from lung disease, and they get coded for that, but not for myositis. So there's no comorbidity coding that's happening on the death certificates.
You want to take that one? I think it's really a matter of educating, and like all of us who work with rare disorders, I mean, we realize that we know more about this than anybody and than any of the clinicians do. And so we really have to educate all the clinicians to make sure that they know that they always have to put those codes for the rare disorder as well as the codes for the other symptoms or the other diseases. Eventually, once these codes get embedded in the electronic medical records, it actually sort of comes up and suggests, it gets more and more idiot-proof over time. So it comes up and suggests to the person that they need to list those codes. So over time, it'll be easier, but none of us have time. That's the whole point. We're all in a hurry.
Well, I think it also helps that there's more awareness of rare diseases. And so if you look at ICD-11 as opposed to ICD-10, there are more codes for rare diseases in ICD-11. That doesn't take away, the base of your question, whether people are going to use these codes. But, having at least the opportunity to code something on a more granular level may help. And then obviously the education has to be there, yeah.
Great. All right.
Hi, thank you so much. Going back to the new drug application, what if a drug is not necessarily what is required for the rare disease, but surgical procedures, lengthening of the limbs, the Elizaroff, the Wagner, the 8-pin? Should those have a code as well, or how does the advancement in those fall into the medical field? Whereas with the drug, you have to follow different protocols. So how do they determine and put it out there that this procedure with the 8-pin has been tried and more successful than the Elizaroff, but also because of the disease you have, like for myself, tumors in the cartilage, it changes the path that way. So
I have to admit that I'm not that familiar how changes in procedures or the application of certain devices actually gets rated and what level of evidence is necessary to get that introduced. I would assume, just based on the approval process that is out there for, let's say, tests, diagnostic tests and so forth, or devices that are being used to administer drugs and so forth, there is a path that is described that the FDA has put down that lists the requirements. I could imagine that comparative studies are difficult to perform. And so I guess that in terms of clinical benefit, it will be difficult to put something down there, but I could imagine that similar to the markers that I mentioned, there may be so-called surrogates that may help assess whether a new procedure had a better effect. And that may be based on improved bone density or better calcification that can be shown on a DEXA scan or something like that. But I can imagine that it's a tough one to show that procedure, also given the numbers often, would be superior to an existing procedure.
Well, let me repeat your question so people can hear you because you don't have the mic. You asked, there are two disorders and they both are under the same code. Yeah, if they're very different, it's going to be hard to study them unless you have two separate codes. However, you can still study them. You just pull them all up and then you have to look manually for the difference between the two. But I was going to also say that there are also ICD-10 codes for the procedures. And so you also want to make sure that the procedures, you can look up the codes for the procedure and see if the procedure is, if there is a code for the procedure, or if there's a different code for a new procedure that's a little bit different. But yeah. You know what? I think we have to go to a different question because we don't have you on a mic. And yeah.
So
Sure.
we'll
Thank you
have
very
one more,
much.
one more question in the floor, and then I'll open it up to the online questions.
Hi, thank you both for the talk. You had mentioned some of the pop-ups that occur with Epic or other healthcare records and some of the challenges in working with that. Do you have any suggestions on how to really tailor what is included in the pop-up for certain conditions? And then probably even more importantly, how to make it a forced selection for clinicians as opposed to a remind me later selection?
I'm probably going to dump this one on Leo, but I do know that, there's an association of coders. There's also the electronic medical record companies, not just Epic, but the other ones that have associations. And I think that they can be lobbied, that they have boards that make some of these decisions, and that as the rare disease community, we can actually approach them and talk to them. But I'm going to dump it on Leo because I don't know how they got in that information that comes down about their clinical trials and their registries.
Well, access to these databases usually is something that is either established via a strategic, if you will, collaboration, and that is oftentimes something that is more likely to occur if it's an organization that we work with that has funding partially via the government, so grants or something like that. One example is Genomics England or the 100,000 Genome Project in the UK. The other databases usually come to the industry, or come to Ionis at least, as far as I know, via fee-for-service kind of agreement. So it's really not, but that's not really addressing your question, right? I mean, I don't know of a mechanism where you really can force the issue, other than really having an improved educational effort across the board.
We do it with physician champions, but I didn't know if there was a better way.
Neither do I, to be honest.
I do. So we're actually out of time now. So maybe we'll do one more question. I'm sorry for cutting that one short. Last question before we end for the session is there a way to hold physicians accountable to mixed diagnosis made through ICD codes?
That's an easy answer.
Yeah, I don't.
That's a shrug.
Well, the only thing that I can say is that if you look at the databases and you follow the path, then, in most cases in rare diseases, you'll find misdiagnosis more likely to occur than not, right? So, and hopefully access to databases, not only for the industry, but also for the prescribers, et cetera, and others, will enable people to get to the right diagnosis quicker.
Great. Thank you. And sorry for cutting it a little bit short. So thank you again to Terry, Joe, and to Leo Sahelijo in providing us this information. Before heading out, we would appreciate if you could jump onto the mobile app and take our brief survey on this session to provide some feedback. If you still have some questions for our speakers, we'll be moving into our networking break, sponsored by Leadient Biosciences. And we ask that if you would like to chat more with our speakers, to head outside or towards the exhibit hall. A few extra reminders before we head out. We have a guided networking session on telling your story and promoting your community, hosted by Travis Flores and Madison McLaughlin, downstairs in Nautilus, as well as an open networking in the exhibit hall, sponsored by PRA Health Sciences, where you can visit our exhibitors and hear from our poster presenters, sponsored by Aldebaran. Our next breakout session will begin at 3 o'clock p.m. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you once again to our speakers.